we hope to see you all then. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Bishop Curry, Gail and I look forward to the conversation that we're about to have. But before we get started, I want to say a word for those who are tuning in. We would like for you to be a part of this conversation, and you can do that by submitting questions that you might have through the Q&A on Zoom. You should see that at the bottom of your screen. You may also make comments in the chat as well. If you are watching on YouTube or from the Diocesan Facebook page, we will be monitoring for questions there as well. And we will allot some time at the end to get to as many questions as we are able. Also, please note that tomorrow morning, we will have an opportunity to talk more about today's session during virtual coffee hours on Zoom from 8:30 to 9:15 before the business session begins. And the link for these sessions will be provided in the chat and will also be available on the convention webpage. Bishop Curry, Gail, and I will be asking you questions primarily about your new book, Love is the Way, that we've both read and enjoyed. And I would commend to those listening in if you've not had an opportunity to read it. But we're going to be asking you questions about your new book through the lens of this new commission that Caleb mentioned, that we have been appointed to co-chair in our diocese, focused on racial justice and racial reconciliation. And so before we get into the questions, I'll turn it over to Gail to say a few words about that commission and about our hopes for its work in our diocese. Gail.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Bishop Curry. I'm Gail DaCosta from Grace Church Cathedral in Charleston. And as Caleb and Adam have said, Adam and I were just recently asked to be co-chairs of this new commission, which is currently named the Commission on Racial Justice and Reconciliation. And so broadly speaking, our purpose is to advance the cause of racial justice, reconciliation, and healing in our diocese, and I would say in the community as well. But we've been given a certain amount of latitude to determine more precisely what we believe we can accomplish, how we should go about it, and even what to name our commission. So we may decide eventually to change the name. You talk in your book about dream language and the power of the dream, and that having a dream and being committed to a dream is essential in bringing about change. So maybe one of our first tasks as a commission should be to determine our dream. What are our hopes for our diocese? We've only met once as a commission, and so I think that the timing is perfect today to have this conversation with you about the issues of racial justice and reconciliation. So I want to just thank you again for being here today.
Right, so getting into the first question, Bishop Curry, you note in your book that the horrible massacre at Mother Emanuel AME Church in downtown Charleston that sits just a couple of blocks from my own congregation of St. Stephen's occurred less than 2 weeks before you were elected our presiding bishop. And you mentioned in the book that this event was one of the events that really drove you to make racial reconciliation an important part of your tenure as our presiding bishop. I wonder, to get us started, if you could speak to us a little bit about what racial reconciliation, racial justice means to you, and what those things require of us.
Well, thank you, Adam and Gail. It's just thank you for what you all are beginning to do and taking this work on. It's Adam, I am so proud. I feel like a proud father to be able to, Adam and I served together in the Diocese of North Carolina. And I just think it's wonderful. Just wonderful to be able to be with you in this way. And again, I thank the two of you and the diocese for undertaking this work. You know, the reality is the the work of racial justice and reconciliation, I think it's important for those two to go together. It's not just racial justice, it is racial justice and reconciliation. Um, I mean, Dr. King, even after the Montgomery bus boycott, or actually said it during it, but afterward was asked, when the boycott had been successful, if you will, desegregating the bus system in Montgomery, he was asked, did he accomplish the goal? And he said, well, the boycott was designed to desegregate public transportation in Montgomery, but really across the nation eventually. He said, but that was only an approximate goal. He said the goal was, of course, desegregation, integration. He said, but the goal is redemption. The goal is reconciliation. The real goal, the ultimate goal, is the creation of beloved community. That the work of reconciliation, of racial justice and reconciliation, really has as its goal, as its ultimate goal, as its dream, as you suggest, Gail, its ultimate dream is the creation of the beloved community, where, as the old slaves used to say in one of their spirituals, there's plenty good room for all of God's children. And that is the ultimate goal. The language of beloved community has a long history in the American context. Dr. King was the one who popularized it, but that was a way of talking about what Jesus in the New Testament talk about when they talk about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, where the reality of God's love is all in all, as St. Paul says. And so we pray for the realization of this beloved community, this reflection of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, every time we say the Lord's Prayer. When we say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are praying that the reign of God's love, which we sometimes, the New Testament calls the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, that the reign of God's love, which Dr. King called the beloved community, might be realized here on earth just as it is in heaven. The work of racial justice and reconciliation is part of that greater work of helping the kingdom to be realized, at least in part, on this earth as it is in heaven. For us in the United States, in the American context, and I'll narrow it down to that, for us in the United States, that is the work of real healing that requires diagnosis, treatment, and then moving forward in a new life. Diagnosis is looking at our past as well as our present. And we've got a racial story together. I say that as a descendant of African slaves. We are in this one together. We've got a history together, and it's helpful to know what that is. What is our story? The good and the bad, and it's a mix, and it is a mix. And it's not just racial in terms of black, white. It's racial in terms of indigenous, the First Nation peoples, indigenous peoples, Native Americans, the struggle to basically to colonize America meant the removal of indigenous peoples from their land. And there is a trail of tears that is part of the story of indigenous peoples in the United States and in Canada. And to a great extent, actually in Latin and Central and South America as well. And that's part of the story. There's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of history there. And we still see the pain of it on the reservations and in some of the urban communities near reservations. So there's a racial past. There's a racial past of chattel slavery and white supremacy and all of that. There's that past that led to a civil war in our country. And we're still wrestling with the vestige of that. But I want to suggest and submit that I wouldn't be here as a follower of Jesus Christ if I didn't believe that past can be redeemed. You can't change what the past was, but you can face it, learn from it, and then turn in a new way to build a new future, having learned from what would have been mistakes of the past, and then working together, black, white, all of us, all folk, working together to build and work a beloved community where there is justice, where there is freedom and justice, liberty and justice for all. And that is the dream of the beloved community. That is the work of racial justice, which faces the past, learns from it, tries to repair the breach as much as we can, and then to construct a new society where there will be plenty good room for all of God's children. And that's the goal on this side of Jordan, and ultimately to reflect thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, just as it is in heaven. I love that story. We read, when did we read it? Was it All Saints or Halloween? I can't remember, where we just read the story of the devil kicking, Michael kicking the devil out of heaven from the book of Revelation, that the devil's been kicked out of heaven. I don't know quite why they kicked him out and sent him down to earth. But anyway, the devil gets kicked out of heaven because in heaven, there is no more evil. In heaven, it is the reign of God's love. And we want this earth to reflect that way and life of love as much as we can get here on this earth until we get to heaven.
So Bishop Curry, that kind of leads right into the next question that I had. In your book, you tell the story of your first trip to New Orleans after your election, to the meeting of the Union of Black Episcopalians. And you said that in the cathedral there, as every cathedral in our church, there's the bishop's, your chair, the bishop's cathedra. And that chair was problematic because it had very troubled origins. You said that it was actually carved by slaves. And that the first bishop, I guess, who sat in it was a secessionist. And therefore it was a physical artifact of our racist past. Mm-hmm. And that this presented you a dilemma. But in the end, you described the service and the way the service was written, and that a big part of it was acknowledging that racist past, mm-hmm. and you said that I just wanted to quote that it was a moment of recommitment to the hard work of redemption and reconciliation, which starts with honesty about ourselves and our complicity with the past. So our diocese here in South Carolina has a very troubled racial history as well, including even the murder of a bishop because he wanted to have a Black bishop here in South Carolina. So how do we go about seeking that kind of honesty if some people really aren't interested in hearing that? If people say, well, I didn't do those things, that's behind us. How do we go about getting that kind of those kind of honest conversations?
Well, there are a couple of things, and I have to say that great credit is due to to Bishop Morris Thompson, who's the Bishop of Louisiana, and many of the people there, that the decision to ask me to come for a new seating, if you will, in the chair and a service of facing the past, naming it, and then committing ourselves to build a new future. That came out of that diocese having done some work, learning about their history and legacy, the legacy of slavery in that diocese or in that area. And one of the things they came up with as a way of, because you can't go back and change the past, but you can redeem it by creating a new future. And that's what they were beginning to do. They had done some work and learning and all of that. So that's one model, a diocese that's done a lot of work, both with Bishop Sage, Brian Sage now, and going back to Bishop Duncan Gray, is the Diocese of Mississippi, which has done a lot of work of historical research and learning what is our legacy of slavery. How has the church benefited from that? And again, not to wallow in the past. The point is not to wallow and not to inflict guilt. That's not the point. The point is to learn what truth we can, and then learn what can we learn so that we can build and construct a new present and a new future. And they've done that really remarkably well in Mississippi. My former diocese, where I was bishop, where Adam served a number of years, had done a lot of that work, and Bishop Rodman, they're continuing a lot of that work, where congregations, archivists, and historiographers were doing their work in parishes. Again, to learn the past and learn from it. And then now, what do we do now? We're not going to stick here. The point is not to beat ourselves up. The point is to learn and then turn in a new direction. Actually, that learning and turning, that's the process of repentance. To repent means to turn. It means to learn from your past, turn to a new future and a new way of living. That's the process that leads to reconciliation. So there are a number of dioceses near you that in Province 4, which with the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina is in the 4th province, that have done this and are doing this work in an ongoing way. I would hold up Mississippi in particular. North Carolina, I know, has done. East Carolina has done work, and I know the others have. I'm just not remembering off the top of my head. But it's worth to do the work. And part of what a commission can do is to help to provide some of the resources in terms of archaeologists and historic methods and stuff to learn what are some of the stories. Tell the stories, as painful as they can be. It's okay. Tell the stories in love, and then what can we learn? And a commission can help to guide, provide resources that other dioceses have already developed. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It already exists. And to do that, and then to channel those learnings, use conferences and gatherings and workshops. I remember we did workshops to bring people together to then figure out, now, how do we transform what was a painful past in many respects into a hopeful future? And that's the work of building beloved community now. What can we do now? We are only victims to fate if we resign ourselves and do nothing. We are people of faith, not victims of fate. And we can follow Jesus into that new future and do the wonderfully difficult work. And this is going on all over the church, and not just in, I still live in Raleigh, not just in our Southern diocese. The Diocese of New York, for example, did this and has done an excellent job, by the way. That's another model. And they discovered that slavery existed in New York. Well, I mean, some of us could have told that, but anyway, discovered that slavery existed in New York and did a lot of work and research. And they made some decisions about how to live their life together as a diocese that was greatly based on their learnings, and then figuring out, now, how can we turn intentionally to a new direction and a new future? Someone who is a mentor and a friend of mine, and Adam would know him, the late Bishop Chip Marble, who was the Bishop of Mississippi. And when he retired, he came and worked with me in North Carolina. Chip used to always say, he said, real progress and movement doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of intentionality. Dr. King said, progress never happens on wheels of inevitability. It happens because people are intentional about changing and finding a better way. And in time, they actually do. So I just think you've got good models for this work. And I just would encourage you. And if you need any support from the churchwide office, Stephanie Spellers oversees our work in evangelism, racial reconciliation, and care of creation. And we will be of any assistance and support that we can. And if you go to the Episcopal Church website and just, I think if you just Google, Google is like Kleenex. They got the name, but anyway, you know, if you go in the search feature and just type in racial justice and reconciliation or something like that, there are a host of resources there that are very usable, including Katrina Brown's Sacred Ground, which is an excellent, and they're free. I mean, these are Episcopal Church. We've curated them. They're available to people of the church. But Sacred Ground was developed by Katrina Brown, who did the kind of facing the past herself as a person from New England, from an old and prominent Episcopal family that goes back to the founding of the church in the colonies, and discovered that the wealth of her family came not only from the rum trade, which they knew, but also from the slave trade. And her family were the ones who produced the film Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north. It's a story of slavery, the slave trade. That was her family. And she works with us on our staff and has developed what I think is one of the best resources. It really is good, that helps us together navigate and face and learn from that painful past, and actually learn from it. It's got a lot of documentary materials. It's already designed and are ready for use by churches to learn from that past, to tell the story, and then to work together to construct a new future. And it's free of charge. You've already paid for it.
Great.
Hey, you're asking to the Episcopal Church, you've paid for this.
Very great.
Bishop, I think that arc you describe is so important, from learning to turning. Gail mentioned that we have had one meeting so far of our commission. It's a wonderful, diverse group of people. We had some great, honest conversation. We talked about the need to do some real learning about the history of our diocese, but some members of the commission said we didn't want to leave it right there. We didn't want to make it an academic exercise. We wanted to turn, and another resource for the whole church that Gail and I have both benefited from is the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta, led by Dr. Catherine Meeks. I had the privilege of representing our diocese for a racial healing pilgrimage that the Diocese of Atlanta put on, where clergy from Province 4 traveled to Savannah and to Charleston, and I thought that was a great example of an experience where we focused on the history, we did a lot of truth telling, but we also then turned and had some real conversation about, so what that mean for us today, and how do we move forward in the work of racial justice in our own time and in our own context. I wonder if there are pitfalls that you have seen as this has been carried forward across the church that you would lift up for us as a word of caution.
Well, the good thing is there are good resources. The Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta is one of those listed in that page that I was talking about. Things like Sacred Ground, things like Becoming Beloved Community, another curriculum. There are actually curricular materials available now that can help to guide the journey, learn, turn, and now do. You see what I mean? That actually can guide, because some years ago, the pitfalls were, there weren't resources for this. There weren't a lot of, and there really are, there's a proliferation of them, and of good ones, and resources that are theologically and spiritually based, grounded. A pitfall is to engage this in a secular manner, solely in a secular manner. And I say that because this isn't simply a matter of secular, it's not a matter of secular politics or of, I mean, obviously there are public policy and how we shape our society implications. I know all of that. But this is also a matter of changing the human heart and learning new ways of living together, as well as making changes in society so that there is equity and liberty for all. It's important to factor the power of amazing grace in this. We are people who know the power of grace to convict, to liberate, and to heal. We follow a Jesus who went to the cross, and there is healing in that cross. And I think a real danger is not to take that at the heart of this work. Reconciliation is hard work because there is some pain. And this is hard work. If you asked me, I guess you asked me, another pitfall is to give up, to just throw your hands up in the air and say, look, there's too much, it's too big, it's too much. Well, yeah, it is big, but can't solve everything. But you can solve one thing. You can't do everything, but you can do something. And that something is like Jesus told Mary and Martha when she was busy. Remember in the Bible, Martha was so busy doing everything and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet. And Martha said, can't you come and clean these dishes with me instead of just sitting and listening to the Lord? And Jesus said, Martha, Martha, you're busy with a lot. One thing is needful. We can't change everything. We can't do everything, but we can do something. And the dangerous temptation is to throw up our hands because we can't do everything.
Well, and I think sometimes the temptation is to turn away from potential conflict, talking about difficult truths. Dr. Meeks, when I was at the Absalom Jones Center, said that she aims to try to create a brave space where people can be brave together, where people can talk about hard things, hard experiences, and not turn away from that. Stay engaged, stay in relationship, stay in community. I think that is also an important ingredient of this work, is to stay in relationship with one another, even when the conversation gets hard.
Right, because the goal is beloved community. You
Right.
see that if that ultimate goal is not there, that's got to be the ultimate goal. And if that's the ultimate goal, then if there's pain along the way, I can live it because it's community. If there's painful truth I can live through it because it's community. You see what I'm getting? That becomes the context, almost the womb in which new birth can happen. And I'm not sure. I mean, I've never given birth. I've been present, but it looked painful to me.
Yes.
And yet a baby's born.
Bishop Curry, I think one of the things that was so good about your book was you related a lot of personal stories, but then you always tied it into the message that you were trying to convey. And so another one of the stories that you wrote about was your, I think this was also shortly after you were elected presiding bishop, your week-long meeting in Canterbury about the move to sanction our church regarding our stand on human sexuality. And you said that everyone was so divided, and that at the beginning of that week, there were some primates who wouldn't even speak to you or who wouldn't sit with you in the dining hall. But then you said that by the end of the week, some of those who wouldn't sit with you at the beginning, they were now making conversations. And you wrote that the more personal we became with each other, the more people's animosity seemed to fall away, and that we couldn't demonize each other when we knew each other well. And so I have kind of two questions following from that. In addition to racial reconciliation, which we certainly need to work towards in our diocese has a unique situation where we've actually had a split, a schism, and it's been very painful, and it's been over 8 years now, and the courts are involved. So how do we face this issue of reconciliation and restoration when things have gotten to this point? And it just seems like such a monumental task for us. And then the other question is this whole idea of change from personal interactions. And we've I've been involved at Grace in a book study that was started around the same time when you were elected as well, because it was in response to the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church here. And it's a joint book study with the AME Church that's right next door to us. And so we've read lots of books, had many discussions, but we've had a lot of discussions about whether it's personal interactions and personal change that's really what we need the most, or whether it's the changing of laws and policies. So how do you respond to that? Is it the personal that's the most important in bringing about change?
Well, it's both, to be very honest. I mean, it's both. That obviously laws and policies have to be changed. That's how we make positive change in a democratic society. And so that's necessary. And various structures of various institutions have to be changed and reworked. But the outward change isn't enough. There has to be the inward change. I've often said, and they were good friends, but I've often said that we need both a Martin Luther King and a Billy Graham, if you will, at the same time. That we need both those who advocate for the change in our outer society, so that children don't go to bed hungry in America, frankly, in the world, but don't go, so that we actually can do the kinds of changes in our society that make it a society for everybody. And yet you can't just change the outward form and not change the inward self. That it has to be whole. I would suggest it has to be almost sacramental, outward and visible sign, as well as inward and spiritual grace, if you will. And I know that I know that the inward change can be more difficult than the outward. You can change laws that prevent someone from physically hitting me, or at least make it difficult. But a law doesn't necessarily change their heart to help them to love me, or me to love them back. That's harder work, but both are necessary. Not simply about race. We're going to need in our country, in this country that I love right now, in the years to come, we're going to need to do the hard work of healing and reconciliation that does not deny difference, but that creates relationship with the capacity to have difference, to have disagreement without being disagreeable. We have got democracy depends on that. And that partially depends on my willingness to make a commitment to, I'm not saying this because that's the title of my book, but I believe it. I have to make a commitment, and I believe we have to make a commitment in the church and in society to be people whose main way of life is a way of unselfish, sacrificial love that seeks the good of others as well as the self. That I just think that is going to be, that is at democratic society will not make it without that kind of commitment from all of us. If it's every man for himself, if it's all about me, I was doing an interview for a secular magazine, a business journal, and they said, okay, the religious language is right, but what about for the corporate exec? How does love translate to the corporate exec? I said, well, it's very simple. It's the difference between it's all about me and it's about we. If it's all about me, that doesn't necessarily include you, which means you may be on the periphery of me. But if it's about we, if I'm committed to our well-being, not just my well-being, then we includes me as well as you. The way of love is about living for the good and the well-being of myself, but of us. And a commitment to that needs to be a fundamental American commitment. That is the commitment that's got to go into the work of racial justice and reconciliation. I've told some of my friends who believe in changing the outward structures, who believe in reforming policing and law enforcement, who believe in legislative changes, who believe in changes in public policy, who believe in justice. I have said to them, and I get in trouble once in a while, I said, justice is not enough. It is necessary, but it is not enough. Justice by itself, untempered by mercy, unguided by love, can degenerate into revenge or another power play where there are winners and losers. Mm-hmm. We are people of love that leads us to do what is just, to leads us to do what is merciful. I think the theme of your convention is walking humbly with God. From Michael. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and love mercy, and to do that by walking humbly with God. So outward and inward, both are necessary.
Bishop Curry, you spoke earlier about hope, about the importance of not giving up. And the subtitle of your new book is Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times. And boy, if these aren't troubling times, we're inching towards 10 months with this coronavirus. People are exhausted. The Episcopal News Service just put out an article talking about clergy burnout in the face of ministry amid COVID. We're just coming off of a very divisive election season that shows just how polarized we all are. And we've had to come to grips with a new racial reckoning in the country. People are tired, and I wonder how we hold on to hope and how we make the work for reconciliation on all fronts sustainable over the long haul.
Yeah. This is, I wrote most of the book before I knew about coronavirus or COVID-19. And the title was before this period. But I have to admit that I was aware of the divisions in our society. The racial reckoning hadn't emerged as it did when George Floyd was killed this year. But the racial realities were there, and I knew that. And the other divisions in our society have been there for a while, and manifest themselves in political ways. The reality is we've got to do this work. We've got to do it. Dr. King, toward the end of his life, said over and over again, we will either learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools. The choice is ours, chaos or community. We must choose community. But there are times when that choice and following that road gets so difficult. And when the way gets weary and it gets rough and it gets tough, and we're living through one of those times. We are. And I mean, I've never imagined a Thanksgiving like this, or Christmas like this. It never even occurred to me. And yet it is what it is. And I think there's light at the end of the tunnel. The vaccines are coming. Somebody said, help is coming. Dr. Fauci said, help is on its way. And I think that's true, but we got a ways to go before we get there. And people are tired. They're weary. And part of it comes from the fact that we're separated from each other. I'm profoundly aware of how much we need each other, how much we act, even when we get on each other's hair, we actually do still need each other. I was on a panel discussion, this is a couple of months ago, early in the pandemic, And it was with a rabbi and I think another clergy person. And I remember the rabbi saying, I miss the people I don't even like. I mean, I said, you're right. We actually do need each other, even when we get on each other's hair. And part of that, I think, is we were actually made for human community anyway. That human life thrives in community. There's time for solitude and silence and all that, but isolation is not healthy. We actually do need whatever it is that we get from each other. We do. Which is why I think the Bible says in the beginning, it is not good for the human one to be alone. We always interpret that as having to do with marriage. Well, yeah, kind of. But actually, this is a statement, God's declaration about human beings. We're meant for community. We're meant to be in relationship with each other. And when that's cut off, something that nurtures us is cut away. And we've experienced, that's what we're experiencing partially. But the other, and this is, we don't think of it this way. When we're cut off from God or feel like we're sort of cut off with the automatic roots to God, like going to church, like going to synagogue or going to worship in community, when that seems cut off, and then we're cut off from each other, we're cut off from the sources of life energy. So what do? Well, we got it. One of the things I've learned is if you can't get the full gusto, get as much gusto as you can. Or as the ethicist would say, get the highest approximation of it. That's fancy language for the same thing. And the truth is, human community may not be possible in its fullest sense, but human contact is. I mean, if somehow constant, regular contact with each other, for good or ill, through these modalities, I can't even imagine what this pandemic would be without Zoom. I mean, imagine if we didn't have this, we'd really be cut off. I shudder to think what it was like in 1918 in that flu that they had then. But to be in contact and intentionally, this is a Chip Marble moment when he said, progress and good doesn't happen accidentally. It happens by intentionality. So that I've had to learn with our kids and grandkids, we have to Zoom. We can't physically be together in the same way, but we can Zoom and be in contact. And I tell folk, if you're high tech, Zoom. If you're low tech, text. If you're no tech, pick up the phone and call. but stay in contact with each other. And the same thing is true with God. We may or may not be able to go back to churches for a while. I mean, that's scattershot right now. But the truth is, that doesn't mean you can't be in contact with God. This is a time to crack open those prayer books, Episcopalians. Crack open those prayer books. There are prayers for individuals. There's the whole morning prayer. There's morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, Compline online. I've gone and I don't tell anybody I'm doing it, but I just quietly sneak on Facebook and watch and sometimes pray Compline with folk on Facebook. I mean, that's all right. Or just open the prayer book, open that Bible, just read something in the New Testament. Read something. Just it's like the old song says, have a little talk with Jesus. Tell him all about your sorrows. Spend some time, intentional time with God. What I've realized is, well, let me tell you a quick story. When the pandemic started, I thought it was going to be over in like a couple of weeks, which was, when I think about it, it's almost laughable now. But I remember I said, well, we should be back in business by Easter. Said, oops. And then I said, well, at the end of April, and all these meetings had been kind of postponed until we said we'll start meeting again in May. No, after I started to realize we're going to be like this for a little while. I mean, I kind of figured, I said, I got to find a way. You got to recreate. You got to come up with a way of feeding yourself. And I was actually reading, it was Matthew 22. It must have been the reading for the daily office. I can't remember, where Jesus and the lawyer says, what's the greatest law in Moses? And Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, something said, if you love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself, God, neighbor, self. So what would happen if every day, as part of my morning practice, I ask the question, you don't have to answer it all the time, but ask the question, what can I do to love God today? what can I do to love my neighbor today? What can I do to love Michael today? And just do one. You don't have to do all three. I'm not telling you, but ask the question, see what emerges over time, and do one thing. One thing is needful. You don't need all three. You don't need 10 different things. One thing. And I actually do that every day. I mean, and some days I think of something, some days I don't. That's all right. But the point is, there is something I realize those three things are three dimensions of my life and my interactions with others, God, neighbor, and self. And after another month, I finally decided I need to do something for Michael. So I got an exercise bike because I can't go to the gym. So I got so I get up in the morning and do my little thing about 5:30 in the morning and do my little thing before everything starts. And, not a big deal, but it was a little something I couldn't do everything. I could do that one thing. And then I started a list of people. I mean, my prayer list has gotten really big, but I added on to the prayer list. And so I've started going through my little list and my prayer time and stuff. The point is, how can I love God, show my love of God, show my love of neighbor, and show my love of self? And somehow out of the question, every once in a while, something pops up that has been feed me. And that's where I'm starting to realize whatever it takes to get a little gusto, you can't get the whole thing right now. A little gusto, God, neighbor, self, whatever it takes, take it and live. The old slaves used to say, walk together, children, and don't you get weary, because there's a great camp meeting in the promised land. The promised land is God's gift. There's a God, and walk together and hold each other's hands. Do that, and we'll figure it out.
Thank you. That's great. I do think, in my experience, we don't take enough time to love ourselves, to realize that we've got to care for ourselves if we're going to, let's love your neighbor as yourself. But if you don't take enough time for yourself, it's hard sometimes to do that. But yeah. That's helpful. I think we're going to try to take some time now to respond to some of the questions that have been coming in from those who are listening. And the first one I see here is from Harriet Green from Good Shepherd in Sumter. She said, "It is true that we may have shared history, but we don't necessarily have shared experiences. How do you reconcile that in the context of empathy?"
And there's a point in the book where I talk about learning, and I'm still learning, to both stand and kneel at the same time. And in the book, I was talking about in conflicted situations, not what she's describing, and what I mean by standing and kneeling at the same time is practicing the practice of seeing you as someone created in the image of God, just as I am, and therefore a child of God, just as I am. Even if you and I have very different experiences, and even if we're at animosity with each other. Whatever, there's a lot of historical baggage, there's a lot of stuff. At the end of the day, every one of us is a child of God. And if I keep reminding myself of that, I have to kneel humbly before you because of the image of God that dwells within you. And yet at the same time, I have to stand with integrity for the convictions that I hold, whatever they happen to be. And that if I can both stand and kneel at the same time, I can never adopt a posture of arrogance, or it will be very difficult to adopt a posture of lack of concern. Because if you're a child of God, just like me, that makes you my sister, my brother, my sibling. And we're somehow related. And, you know, kinfolk can drive you up a wall, but they're still your kinfolk. And so being able to stand in our integrity of convictions that we hold, beliefs that we hold, and at the same time being able to kneel and listen to a brother or sister, that creates the context in which empathy may emerge. And that's empathy without compromising conviction. But it can be genuine. And the other thing is, my daddy used to tell me, he said, you know, never judge any book by its cover. Always read the book. Which means and I tell you, I'm old enough to know now, everybody, there's a story in every life. And everybody who acts up, there's a story. There's a read. They didn't come into the world that way most of the time. There's a story. And sometimes just listening to the story may help me understand. I may not agree, but if I can understand, okay, I can understand. I just did a conversation with Dr. Russell Moore, who is he's the director of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Public Policy group. And they brought the two of us together. we know each other, brought the two of us together because we come from two very different places. He's the lead ethicist for the Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And so we were together at National Cathedral by the National Institute on Civil Discourse together, because it's possible for people who differ profoundly to cultivate a relationship that can be the container for their differences. And it's work. It doesn't happen easily, but it can be done. And I believe that in all of our personal stories. Now, I'm also a realist. I've been around. I've been a pastor a long time. And I also know that there's a time for every matter under heaven. that there are times when that's possible and times when it's not. But I love that passage in Romans 12, where Paul says, insofar as it lies within you, be at peace with all people. I love that, insofar as it lies within you, which was a way of saying you can't control what somebody else does. All you can control is what you do. Insofar as it depends on you, be at peace with everybody, but they may not be at peace with you, and you can't control that. That's okay. You never know when the day will come or if the day will come. And that's good advice. That's not me, that's St. Paul. So I figure that's pretty good advice.
Do you want to take the next one, Gail? Do you see?
Yeah, so we have another question. This is from Reverend Dr. Michael Schaefer from St. Francis here in Charleston. So he says, in following in the way of Jesus, whether it be in pursuit of racial justice or truth and justice of any flavor, what are your thoughts about our responsibility to get into, quote, good trouble, or to turn over tables when necessary? And what models and principles should we follow in doing so?
Well, I mean, I think the models and principles, John Conyers is a good, John Lewis is a good one. He obviously with Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi and others following the footsteps of Jesus, they engaged in nonviolent protest and nonviolent means of social change, of which protest was just one possibility. And they didn't get to the stage of protest or civil disobedience on down the road until all else had failed. And so the point is to negotiate. The point is to be in conversation, to be in relationship, and to seek and to work within the system as much as is possible. And then if all else fails, that's when they resorted to boycotts or means of public protest or even civil disobedience is the furthest out. Henry David Thoreau, all of those who have taught the ways of nonviolent change have been very clear that turning over the table, so to speak, is probably the last ditch. But as a nonviolent, you turn over the tables, but you don't harm a human being. I mean, even Jesus in the temple, he made his point. He turned over the tables. As far as I know, he didn't whip the human beings. And that's a very, and I say all of that to say that we must work for the kind of change that will be genuine change. And you know, we're fortunate in this country that we can work with, we have a system that is amenable to the interaction between different ways of understanding, and we can change things within the system. And there are times when people have had to go beyond the system to dismantle Jim Crow. You had to go beyond Jim Crow and dismantle it. And yet, even that dismantling was not a dismantling of the American system. It was actually an attempt to get to the actual ideals and values of the United States of America. So that's a piece of it. The other thing is, I am very aware that it's sometimes too easy to jump to the quickest way of change. My experience of change is that it's slow, that it's hard and laborious work, and it takes years in coming. My granddaddy was a sleeping car porter. He was in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters with A. Philip Randolph. They marched on Washington in the 1940s, but they didn't see any changes. A. Philip Randolph, who led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, lived long enough to be there in 1963 when they marched on Washington again, and eventually a civil rights bill came out of it. My point is that change didn't happen overnight. It happened year after year with people working and working and working to bring about the change that eventually happened. And that's true with all social change. Truth is, it's true with most of us in personal change. Most of us don't change overnight. At least I haven't. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't think so. Most of us, it takes it's a gradual change of kind of, you know, it just takes a while. Anyway, that's just the nature of change, whether it's personal or whether it's social. And I want to encourage working for the kind of change that reflects the way of love with methods that are consistent with love. Because you can't get the beloved community by non-loving ways. It won't happen.
We have time for a couple more. Bishop Curry, Steve Capps from Okatee writes, are we discussing reconciliation in the church or within the society? Assuming they are separate, how does the church witness that reconciliation to the society? I'm not sure they are separate. What do you think?
No, I wouldn't say they're separate. I mean, they overlap. I do think, in all honesty, that the work of racial justice and reconciliation that's going on in the church could well be a laboratory for the wider society as well. Which is to say, the work of racial justice reconciliation, we kind of start with ourselves, but we broaden out. You see what I'm saying? And that this may be one context where the church and faith communities can actually model a way of learning from the past and turning toward and building a new future. We can actually do, and by being honest, by being honest with ourselves, not pretending that we don't have sins. I don't know why a community like the Christian religion would want to pretend that we don't have sins. I don't know if this is breaking news, but guess what? All have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Sin is an equal opportunity employer. I'm here to tell you that's again. So no need pretending that we don't have sins. So what are they? Let's name them. Let's face them. Let's learn from them, and now let's turn and build a new future. And I think the church, we actually have the potential to model doing this, because one good thing about us in the church, we don't let things go. You know, if we do something 3 times, we've always done it that way. And if we're doing the work of racial reconciliation and justice, and we keep doing, we have a habit of staying in for the long haul. We actually do. And I know full well the society's going to go off to something else in 2 years. But if the church keeps plodding along, just like A. Philip Randolph, going to Washington every year with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, keeps plodding along, it can become a model and a witness to society. We're being honest with our house, and we want to be better, and we can be better, and we're going to work together with each other and with God to be better. And you know what? We can do that in society too. I think that, so I actually think it's both and. I agree with you, Adam. No question about it.
I mean, for me, the connection is if we can't do the work within the church, our witness in the world and in the society is just not going to be able to be what we might want it to be. So it's an integrity thing as well for me. So.
Yeah. And the nice thing is people respect us if we're honest. They don't expect us to be perfect. In fact, they already know we're not. so we don't have to pretend. And yet to have that has authenticity to it. We have messed up, and we've done wrong, but we're not going to stay that way. See what I mean? And we're going to face our past and learn from it and turn and go in a new direction. And we can. This is just a little story. It's not a big one. But when I was the brand new bishop of North Carolina, now here I am, Black bishop, and of one of our historic Southern dioceses, and we hadn't had a diocesan before in the South, and so there were things I found out that I didn't know, and so I was sitting in my office, and my assistant came in, a dear woman, came in, and she was beet red. I mean, I looked at her, I said, Sergio, what's wrong? I mean, she was red. And I said, Sergio, what's wrong? She said, well, you need to read this. And so she gave me a little piece of paper. And so I read on the paper, and it was a trust fund for seminarian scholarships. And every bishop had to read the terms of the trust, and sign that you would obey. And the trust fund read, this fund has been established. It dated from around the turn of the century, 1900, early 1910, 1920, something like that. This trust fund has been established for the benefit of the white race, and the fund proceeds from this fund can only be used for it was theological education, whatever the language was, of members of the white race. And I said, Sergio, you can't, I'm Black, so you don't know I'm red, but what am I supposed to do with this? She said, well, if you're going to disperse money to seminarians, you have to agree to that, or you can refuse. I said, over my dead body, I said, no, I'm not going to do it. So I got all righteous about it and said, oh, no, we're going to fight this. So I wrote a letter, quickly sent off a letter to the Episcopal Church Center in New York, 815 2nd Avenue, copied the presiding bishop, sent it to the treasurer of the church, and said, this is unconscionable. Something needs to be done. The terms of the trust must be changed somehow. Anyway, so I got a nice letter back saying that it's really hard to change the terms of it was a will. I mean, it's hard to do that. And so I went to the next meeting of the bishops of the 4th province, which would be the South. And I was a new bishop. I was young. I was like 45 or something like that. And I said, I told them about this, and turned out a number of them had refused it as well. They just hadn't talked together about it. And so we just decided that we were going to communicate with New York and say, this has got to be changed. And it took a while. And eventually they had to go to court, and there was a number, but eventually they did change the terms of the will so that any seminarian can receive funds from this particular trust to study to become a priest of the church. Now, that's just a little thing, but that was part of our story. That was an Episcopal trust fund proceeds of which came from chattel slavery. That's our story. Now, there was learning there. And now how can that be used for good to build a new future? Well, we had to change the will. We had to do some of that. But, you know, don't give up. Never give up. That's John Lewis taught us that. Never give up. Winston Churchill taught us that. Never give up. Don't give up in the work of love.
Well, Bishop Curry, I think that's a good note to end on, and we really appreciate you taking the time to kick off our convention with this discussion. And thank you to all those who have watched today and participated by sending in your questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to more, but please keep in mind that tomorrow there'll be an opportunity during the virtual coffee hour sessions on Zoom from 8:30 to 9:15 before the business session begins to continue the conversation. And the link has been provided in the chat and is also available on the convention webpage. And we hope to have you join us for the convention Eucharist, where Bishop Curry will be our preacher at 6 p.m. This evening. Again, thank you very much, Bishop Curry. It's been great to talk to you and to reunite. I very much appreciated all the time we shared in North Carolina.
Adam and Gail, thank you both.
Thank you.
And to all of my friends in the diocese, God bless you. And just have a great convention. Have a great convention. And as good a Thanksgiving as you can.
Right.
All right. Bye-bye, Bishop Curry. Thank you.